Hello and welcome to Cargo Shorts, brought to you by Old Dominion Freight Line. I'm your host, Jonathan Betz, and today we're going to discuss the future of freight payment and the race towards automation. The trucking industry, specifically less than truckload carriers, have reached an inflection point where digitization and automation are a critical part of the industry's future. But who will drive that transformation? Like most things we experience in life and business, change takes time and leadership. We've seen manual processes being replaced by automation, which leads to many downstream benefits for both the shipper and carrier. Joining me to talk about all of this are two guests passionate about this subject: Todd Polen, Vice President of Pricing Services for Old Dominion Freight Line, and Garrett, Senior Vice President at Freight Plus and founder of Understand LTL. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
So Todd, let me start with you. You've been pretty vocal about this issue within your professional network. Freight payment today still is an extremely manual and clerical heavy process. I'm sure that often can lead to mistakes, time, labor, ultimately added costs. So when you're talking to shippers, what do you hear about the freight payment process?
Whenever I do talk to shippers, it's generally a miserable experience for them. They rely on 3PLs or freight payment providers to do the audit function generally. Any customer of any size is basically outsourcing that activity. And the problem is, as an industry, we've kind of done it to ourselves. In other words, the current way that you put charges on a freight bill with the old classification system, and then, of course, every carrier's reweighing freight, using new technologies like Shiplify to add accessory charges to freight bills. Very rarely do the bills actually match up what the customer thought it was going to be when they actually quoted the shipment to begin with. And there's your problem. So, the outdated system of how we actually arrive at the rate has led to this. Now, the funny thing is, carriers have actually gotten smarter over the years and done all these things to get the correct charges on the bill to begin with. So everything the carrier is doing actually is fair and legitimate, but the problem is it convolutes the freight payment process.
So Curtis, what do you say is the answer to that? Your reaction?
Well, I agree with that. I think it comes down to incentives, to be honest. Incentives are a strong force, everywhere, including our industry. And if you look at what the carriers are incentivized to do, that's get the invoice to the customer as quickly as possible. And they're very good at that. And what some of these auditing firms are incentivized to do is to maybe push back and dispute and not give payment unless it's absolutely written on the wall that it's correct. And they're very good at that. So I think what we're missing is that, that standard infrastructure in between to get both sides talking, communicating a lot easier about billing discrepancies, because as Todd mentioned, we know it's a big thing in the industry and probably will for some time. So there's still a lot of manual, email-driven, paper-driven processes in basically the exception bucket for anything that doesn't just perfectly match. And those should all be automated. Those should be API-driven, data science and AI-driven to make decisions based on the logic that's set up there.
So Curtis, why isn't it automated? And help us understand, where does the digital transformation fit into all of this then?
I think we're real early still in the full LTL digital transformation. There's some exciting ideas and different companies, different groups doing some pretty cool things right now, building out some tech and automation. But it's still in a state of chaos, I would say. There's still, and part of that is by nature of the industry. You have just enough large players in this LTL industry to have some, semblance or hope of unity and standardization, but then just enough as well that, a lot of big companies kind of go down their own path and do it their own way. And so you have those two forces working against each other, I believe. And I think it's going to take just more of a connected digital infrastructure, that everybody can agree on. And what we are seeing in some cases with, bill of lading data and things to that nature, stuff like that is going to have to progress a little more before we're all on the same page. And honestly, I equate it to, if you think of the banking industry or finance in terms of accepting payments online. There was a company called Stripe that most people don't know of, but 10 or so years ago just changed the landscape of vendors and businesses and banks, moving money around online. And I think we need something similar that is broad enough to cover the whole LTL landscape.
So, Todd, let's talk about the LTL classification system. What predictions do you have for the future of how we might classify freight? What changes do you see on the horizon?
Recently, there's been a change of leadership at NMFTA. There's a lady named Debbie Sparks. She's in charge. She's been great. And I think it's been extremely valuable for her to be the leader because she comes outside the industry. I mean, she was with the industry somewhat as it relates to truckload, but not necessarily LTL. And I think the changes that are coming are going to be good because NMFTA has now they're more marketing oriented. So now they're actually going to discuss publicly what has been done privately. So I think there's a lot of good things that are brewing that they realize to stay relevant, they're going to have to make these changes so that they can be a voice of the industry, not just the carriers, but also third parties and shippers, so that everybody feels like they're providing a service to the industry. And that's going to be the key for them long term to remain viable. We all need the bill of lading that's part of the book, and we all need the packaging requirements. Those are two beneficial things that will always be there, but the classification will change, it will get simplified, and it will be made easier to use for the reasons I just outlined. And I really believe it's going to happen.
Times are certainly changing. So, Curtis, what do you say to all this? Do you see a simplified process in the near future, the distant future? If so, what's it going to look like?
Yeah, there's no question. There's definitely got to be a more simplified process. I kind of break down the NMFC classification system in two buckets. There's the theory of it, which is really sound, and it makes a lot of sense. And when you have most carrier costs driven by space on the trailer, which is the density part Todd mentioned, time at pickup or delivery, cross-docking, just processing and applying labor towards the account, and then risk with, again, pickup and delivery locations, freight type, loadability, how it plays in the trailer with other shipments. Those are all represented within NMFC classifications, and that's sound. I think the application of it, though, is tricky, and that's where you have newcomers to the industry that get handed, it used to be a book, now it's a website login. Here, go get acquainted with these 7,000 or 8,000 different items, and it's just a good way to turn people away from your industry pretty darn quick. I remember when I moved from operations into weights and inspections and learning the rules tariff and and the NMFC classifications, it was like learning a brand new language. And one, mind you, where there's not a lot of pictures or visuals to help you, even though it's all driven by space and physical, shapes fitting into other shapes. So there's just a lot of visual communication, I think, that needs to evolve. I predict and I hope that we keep kind of the foundation of what the NMFC items, were put in place for. I think that does benefit everybody. I think we need to smooth out the transition between the different tiers, like when you go from one class to the next, or when you go from no overlength fee to an overlength fee. There's just some sharp, rises and declines. And that's where I hear the most complaints, to be honest, with shippers and 3PLs is, how does 2 inches, equate to now $2,000 more on my bill, on my invoice? So I think we need to smooth out the transitions, but 80% of it, I would say, is good. We just, going back to previous questions, the flow of accurate data between parties is what's going to fix this. Until we nail that down and get everybody sending and receiving information, carriers should not have to run a hopefully accurate data sample through a isolated cost model with, some overhead and different things figured in to then lock in pricing for 12 months time. That's just crazy. I don't know of any other industry that does that. So to get just more of a dynamic flow of operational and costing data going back and forth between all parties, that will unlock, the ability for all of us to have more automated pricing, have less of a, a labor heavy solution with manual reviews and costing and that sort of thing.
So Todd, you've used the analogy of the LTL grocery store. Tell us, what does that mean?
The LTL grocery store, I'm not even sure where I came up with that, but the analogy works like this. You head off to your nearest grocery store. My case might be Harris Teeter or Food Line. You go back to the meat counter and you say, I'd like to have a pound of filet mignon. And they wrap it up, they weigh it. But when you go to the counter at this grocery store, instead of looking at it and scanning it and barcoding it, and you walk out and you get charged for whatever they put on the barcode, in this grocery store, which is the world of LTL, the clerk asks you, what do you have there, Mr. Polen? And I say, you know what, I've got a pound of hamburger. Or better yet, maybe it's only half a pound of hamburger. And they ring it up and you walk out the door. And that's kind of how it works in LTL. We're the only industry that I'm aware of that basically says, whatever you tell me it is and it weighs, I'm going to charge you for that. And unless I find out otherwise and can somehow prove to you that you lied or were mistaken, then I can't change the bill. So we're the most backwards industry as it relates to how we price our freight. And part of that is going back to that old classification system, right? The primary way we get paid is in weight, which is very rarely known exactly by the shipper. So you have that number one flaw in there. And then number two, the description is also, they tell us and then we have to prove otherwise. And that's the bad thing about the classification, because you're associating a class with a weight. Whereas in any other industry, including parcel, you're getting paid on cube primarily. And if the cube's not what it needs to be, there's a dim factor and you go on with your life. So we've kind of made it extremely difficult for ourselves. And then now we have these large departments and we spend millions of dollars on scales, W&I departments, and all these things to get the correct charges on the bill. And then, of course, that creates the downstream problem of freight payment that we just discussed, where it doesn't match up. So it's kind of ironic that the LTL grocery store in the end promotes dysfunction.
To add another layer to that grocery store analogy that I've heard commonly used, with most LTL carriers now using API rating, shippers and 3PLs are constantly quoting through the API on various shipments. And that's equated to taking something off the shelf, putting it in that cart as they're pushing it around the store. And so, to bolt on to Todd's example, they roll up to the checkout. Not only are they responsible for telling you what's behind the brown paper, but they want a price, and they don't necessarily want to commit to how many of those steaks they're going to buy. They may get the 2-for-1 price and then decide to go back and put one back on the shelf. But hey, I still want that 2-for-1 price on the one I got. So yeah, apparently LTL is synonymous with grocery stores. And again, to Todd's point, the costs and revenue for LTL carriers just don't align. Revenue is driven by weight and class, costs driven by space, time, and risk, as I mentioned. So I like to call the rules tariff duct tape. It basically is just meant to kind of realign these two forces so they can, somewhat meet in the middle.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, the LTL grocery store. And it does seem like a pretty big disconnect there. So Curtis, what needs to be done to fix this? What processes need to be improved or automated for LTL shippers?
I think most of this is going to happen behind the scenes. It's going to be the digital infrastructure of the industry. It's not going to be one specific company rolling out a new set of protocol for APIs or for billing or anything like that. It's going to be something that the whole industry needs to latch onto and agree with. And I think the magic is going to be in the translation part of it. We hear all the time that a carrier has to log into an appointment setting portal or a billing portal or vice versa. A shipper or 3PL has to log into a carrier portal to get a document or something. We're never going to get everybody using the same portal. So I think that's fine. Everybody should design their interface and their UI the way they want their customers and their employees to use it. But it's going to be it's the conduit behind the scenes that can pull in the different types of data and information from each one of those, company facing platforms and apply the magic in the middle to translate it into some sort of standardized or apples to apples output that everybody else can then consume. And that's what technology and APIs allow us to do. We don't all have to agree to 100% of the way it works and looks. We just have to get the foundation, and the primary pieces aligned. And then you can build off of that however you want to as a company.
So Todd, we talked a lot about the issues and the challenges the industry is facing. Let's talk about what Old Dominion is doing. I understand that you guys have rolled out a new program that may be the future of LTL pricing. So what can you tell us about this new one rate, one time program?
As a result of everything that we've talked about, whether it's freight payment, quoting, and everything else to make the process better, it became painfully apparent to me that we had to do something to stop the process and make it better. Hence, we developed the one rate, one time program, and we're testing it out as we speak right now. The big difference in the one rate, one time is if somebody wants to quote a rate, you have to give me a full address, and I have to be able to validate it on either end. So I know where it's going. So I can figure out all the things that I need to know. Is it a residential delivery? Do I need a lift gate? Is it going to some grocery warehouse that requires a lumper, et cetera, et cetera? So I can factor in all the variables and give the customer a price, just like when you book a shipment on Orbitz, for example, for airline fare. You get a price, and that's what you get charged, and that's it. And that's the goal of the one rate, one time. We want to introduce a new way of doing business, which is basically I want freight payment auditors to go away. I want that industry to just disappear. And the reason I want that to happen is it's a waste of everybody's money and resources. Again, we're the only industry in the world that has to go through this process to get paid. There should not be a matching issue. We should get the right price up front and be done with it. And you're much better paying paying a fair price up front without all the accessory charges and get it done versus paying six figures to Cass or, one of these other large companies. When you're a multi-million-dollar shipper, you're paying a ton in freight payment. And every time a shipment doesn't match, guess what? If manual intervention is required, they typically charge the shipper more money for manual intervention. So there's just no need for that. It's a hidden cost in the supply chain, probably billions of dollars of waste due to this current structure. So we developed the one rate, one time process so that, we don't want to grow our collections department either, have to go chase money all the time. It's not efficient for anybody, and we think it serves the industry well. And it's also something can be used on a dynamic pricing type method as well, because my price may change. Just like if you buy an airline ticket closer to the day that you actually go, you're going to pay more versus booking it a month out. Airline folks know this and have been doing it for years, and it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where the industry is going to be heading. And I think Curtis is right. He made a comment earlier too about 12-month cycles, and you put your best foot forward. You hope you get what you hope you get the business that you think you're going to get, and you may or may not get it. Yet the shipper wants to hold you accountable, for a year and say, you can't change my price. I've got my budget, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think this way might be the ticket in the future. And especially, it's also an incentive. The one rate, one time can be an incentive to customers, because guess what? If you give me good data up front and I find behind the scenes that your weights are generally correct and your cube is generally correct, and I can trust everything that you give me, I'm going to give you a better price up front because you're absolutely the customer I want to see in the future. Whereas if you're one of these customers that, are trying to hoodoo me, for example, and your weights are consistently off 40% or your cube's off, well, I'm going to be pricing you higher than the guy who tells me the truth. So there's all these things that will be going on behind the scenes. And I think it's going to be a game changer. And I think that, it's one of those things that it's so obvious. I'm kind of surprised that we're the first person to develop it, but I think pretty soon it's going to be standard.
Yeah, it does sound like a game changer for sure. So, Curtis, final thoughts for you, big picture. Is the industry changing fast enough? And how is it going to change in the future to meet the challenges ahead?
I think the industry is changing as fast as we can handle it changing. I think, again, theories and ideas are great, but execution of those is a lot harder. And it takes ideas like Todd's and testing it with trusted partners to really vet it and iterate and fix the bugs and, check it off before you roll it out to the greater market. So I'm excited. I mean, it's a great time to be an LTL, I think. And what Todd was saying kind of made me think there's a huge opportunity here. We're all kind of in the basement, so to say, of in this muck and mire of just the verify and double check and collections game. But there's a huge opportunity for people to lead with better data, better integration to their carriers and other partners, and leapfrog and get way ahead of everybody else. So I think the middle is gonna hollow out a little bit. There's gonna be 60 to 70%, of maybe shippers on the lower end, maybe even a larger percentage, and a smaller percentage that really figure it out, buy into it, and don't spend as much time thinking about timing the market and when rates might be softer versus just continually investing in their process to be a better shipper.
Well, certainly transportation continues to see the benefit of automation, digitization, and making shipping more simplified. As we've heard today, it takes collaboration between the shipper and the carrier to make transformation happen. Thank you both, Todd and Curtis, for a great conversation and for sharing your valuable insights. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our full Cargo Shorts podcast series. Visit the resources section of the Old Dominion Freight Line website at odfl.com, where you can also find additional information and materials on this topic. Thanks for listening.